Okay, I believe that we are live and we're getting started. Hello, I am Commissioner Emma Pinter. I serve as the chair of the Adams County Board of County Commissioners. I am a Truman member. Happy to be here tonight on this panel on national security and voting. It couldn't be more timely and it couldn't be more important for what's happening. Ballots are going out. Jena, we got our Secretary of State, Jena Griswold, with us. How many days till when ballots drop in Colorado?
Gosh, you start with a trick question. I don't know exactly how many, but they start on October 9th. So all the math whizzes out there, do the math. It's I can look if you
so whenever you're watching October 9th, we'll start heading out. You should have them at home probably within 3 to 5 days of that. Yeah. So any moment now, 2 days. That's great.
16 and overseas and military ballots already went out.
Okay. So if you're in the service, your ballot is on its way right now. Great. So welcome all. It's Zoom, so I'm trying to give everyone a second to log on. This is our Truman National Security Project chapters discussion around voting, the election, national security concerns. We are joined by Jena Griswold, the Secretary of State for Colorado, ACLU-Colorado Public Policy Director Denise May, and MSU Denver Chair of Political Science Robert Preuhs. We'll start with brief bios of our illustrious colleagues and then get right into the questions because time is precious, and I know the Secretary has another engagement. We only have about half an hour, maybe we'll push to 40 minutes of our time. We'll see how strict her staff get or how interesting our questions get. So we'll see how that goes. Welcome everybody. So we have with us tonight, Secretary Jena Griswold, the 39th Secretary of State of Colorado, just the 10th woman to be elected to the constitutional statewide office in Colorado, and is the youngest Secretary of State ever elected in the United States?
No, I don't think ever. I think right now.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, you're certainly trailblazing, and that's for sure, especially in an election where everything is so important. You're a passionate defender of access to elections and voting, and you have led one of the largest democracy platform packages in the nation, including increased access to voter registration, polling locations, and mail-in ballots, drop boxes. And I was just talking with some of my staff in Adams County that we are going to be opening voting service centers on Sundays, which was always allowed by law, but we might be the first county in Colorado to do it. So I'm super excited about that. We'll be following up with my clerk, Josh Sigelbaum, about that. Robert is Robert Preuhs, professor and chair of political science at MSU Denver, Metro State University, Denver, with a focus of research on representation, democracy through the lens of racial and ethnic politics, published author, co-authored a book on this topic, as well as regular publications in professional journals. He received his PhD and his MA from the University of Colorado Boulder, specializing in American politics, public policy, and research methodology. His master's of public administration from the University of New Mexico, and graduated, I won't say the year because we're all young in life and we're always learning. And if you're active in Colorado politics, Denise May is very familiar to you. She's our Director of Public Policy for the ACLU of Colorado, and in that role, she oversees all legislative work that affects civil liberties at the state and local level. She's primary person overseeing the legislative initiatives for the state capitol during the ledge session, and sits on various municipal boards and commissions, review police and jail-related matters, frequent panelist on the civil liberties. Very grateful for the ACLU. Thank you so much all for joining us this evening. We'll jump right in with our questions. There is a Q&A box if you are joining us. At this point, you probably have done a Zoom meeting before, but if you haven't, you can put a question in the question and answer, and we will be seeing those on our end, and I'll be trying to field them while our panelists answer questions. And we'll start with you, Jena. We have a lot of news out there that Department of Homeland Security says that Colorado tops the nation in our security protections, but it has been reported that Russian hackers have been jiggling the lock on Colorado's voter election databases. As Secretary of State, what protections do you have in place for our elections data that would make our elections secure?
Well, first off, before even starting, the first off is nice to see everybody. Robert, nice to meet you. Denise, always a pleasure. Emma, I have not talked to you since March at the beginning of the pandemic. So just so excited to be on a panel with you all, and maybe I'll become a Truman member in the future if you all have me. But I would say, look, Colorado is considered the safest state to cast a ballot in today. It's not just my word, it's the Washington Post 2018 said we were literally the safest state to cast a ballot in today. And with the hyper partisanship right now, I think it's noteworthy that President Trump's former DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen also commended us for our leading cybersecurity. And in Colorado, you can't manipulate the actual election. We have a voter verified paper ballot. Paper ballots cannot be hacked through cyber attack. That's one of the reasons the nation needs vote by mail for all. But we have a paper ballot. None of our voting equipment is connected to the internet. I actually have a 40+ IT team with our own security team. They do a secure build of all voting equipment to make sure that it's not connected to the internet. And then we do something that Emma, you might have heard about before, called a risk limiting audit, which is a very nerdy topic, very wonky topic. Some of the best mathematicians from MIT and Stanford came up with an algorithm, basically, that once we use it, shows us to a statistical degree of certainty that the election outcome is correct. So when we're talking in Colorado about cybersecurity, we're not talking about the actual election itself. We're talking about election infrastructure, support systems, our online voter registration database, our statewide poll book. And we're a leader in the nation when it comes to protecting that support, the support programs. And we can go into everything we're doing to lead the nation, but overall, I think we're in a really good spot. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about expanding vote by mail for all is not only is it the most responsible way to vote during a pandemic, not only is it convenient and increased participation rates by 9% in Colorado, it's one of the most secure ways because a paper ballot cannot be attacked with a cyber attack.
I love that. I love that description. I am familiar with the risk limiting audit. I served on my Canvas board in Adams County for a number of years before being elected countywide. And it's a beautiful process to behold. Call your county clerk, ask if they're still doing tours or accepting poll watchers. It's an amazing thing to see your clerks in action. The system is really designed well. But one of the things in county government that we've seen a lot, particularly watching the census play out this year, is there's still a lot of misinformation. There have been groups that are pushing to push out misinformation that make it very challenging for somebody receiving their ballot to feel confident. What are you seeing? There are some of these attempts to push out misinformation, and particularly targeting our Black and brown residents and recent immigrants that have been targeted in some of these misinformation campaigns. What are you seeing out in the world right now that we learned during the census or that we're seeing unfold during this election cycle that we should be paying attention to?
The question is for me also. Yeah, double header, double opener. Well, I would say misinformation is one of the biggest worries for this election. We did see in 2016, Russia try to undermine our democracy with both the scanning of election infrastructure across the nation, but also with ransomware attacks and disinformation. And it's very difficult. You know, Colorado is considered a leader when it comes to protecting our democracy. We monitor both the social media and the dark web. We're actually about to hire a vendor to help us monitor further disinformation. And the way we counter disinformation is with the truth. But disinformation comes, or misinformation comes in all different shapes and sources. Unfortunately, there is a lot of confusion around the election. Sometimes it's innocent, sometimes it's a mistake, sometimes it's purposeful. You've seen the president, the attorney general, and other folks high up in the administration lie to try to confuse or suppress the vote. And sometimes it's a coordinated attack. And I think it's really important that when we talk about misinformation and disinformation campaigns specifically, disinformation isn't just one person telling an accidental or an intentional lie. It's a coordinated attack by a foreign country using social media to try to suppress voters, to trick voters out of how they would vote or to get them to not vote at all. And unfortunately, the president has done absolutely nothing. He's apologized for Putin. He's apologized and given cover for foreign interference. And Senator McConnell has blocked meaningful legislation. You know, a piece of legislation that I had put together that we were, I know Denise was being consulted, various groups were being consulted last legislative session, was a comprehensive package to combat misinformation. And it was really with the understanding that if the federal government, which is the appropriate body to protect our nationwide election infrastructure and our nationwide democracy, isn't going to act, we are going to. You know, with COVID, the legislation did not get through. I do think it's something that we should continue to think about in the future. But that didn't stop us. Even though our legislation didn't get through, we're still actively monitoring, trying to push back on falsehoods. And I actually launched a new unit. We were able to coax onto our team one of the national leading experts out of the Department of Homeland Security, who was the acting assistant deputy for counterterrorism and disinformation for the US government. He joined our team, gosh, a couple months ago at this point, and he's leading initiatives to help us combat disinformation and push out correct information. So it's not a one solution type of issue. It really does require federal intervention and federal leadership that is just not going to happen pre-2020. From a congressional level and a White House level, I will say the civil servants at the Department of Homeland Security do a fantastic job and they do everything that they can. But it's something that we all really need to be cognizant about. And as community leaders, as folks who have a platform with your friends and family and others, it's important to remind people to be wary of where they're getting their information. Be wary about how you use social media. Social media is a great tool. It connects us. How many people, like from 20 years ago, from childhood, from high school, would you never be in touch with, but now we can, and it's great. But it also is a tool that can really undermine our democracy, and Americans just need to be aware that they need to be literate when it comes to social media and really suss through what is what and what the source of the information is.
Well, that's certainly true, and there's a lot for us to be paying attention to. Just turning to the rest of our panel, what are some of the strategies that we could recommend to strengthen democratic participation? Reaching out to your network and sharing trusted sources seems like good advice, but what strategies do you recommend?
Sure. Let me start off. You know, I think those are fantastic reasons. There's a couple of things that we know from political science that work more on that individual level. So one is actually social pressure kind of works, right? So let your networks know that it's important to vote, that you're participating, and then that little nudge, and it can be negative actually, saying, you know, we know you didn't vote, or we're going to know that you didn't vote if you don't let us know. Those things actually work, and they work about as well as, say, campaigns knocking on doors and reminding people to vote, or the traditional way of calling folks up that were in the that hadn't voted during the voting day, during that period, and checking with the precinct list and calling and saying, you know, it's time to vote. So we get a bump there. You know, Colorado's exceptional in a lot of ways because we have instituted most every reform that political science has found to actually really have a big effect, from mail-in ballots to same-day registration to pre-registration. All those things are things that we can do from a public policy perspective as well.
Okay, anything that you would add, Denise, from over at the ACLU perspective on encouraging voter participation?
Well, I think I really do think Robert and Secretary of State Griswold really hit on the most important ones. I think what we also have to do is put a lot of energy into some areas of the community where we need to lift up voter participation, primarily in the African American community as well as the Latinx community. And so I think that to the extent that we can rely on, and if with the Secretary of State's office can rely on, and county clerk's offices actually can rely on people who are the best messengers to tell folks how to register. And sometimes the best folks are the ones that are in the community already. I think that's one of the strongest ways to get particular communities is to rely on the folks that they know and can trust. It's the trusted messenger that matters a lot. I think we could do a lot more with Spanish language radio, with other means of communication so that we're getting the right word to the right communities. I think those are areas sometimes overlooked, both by the parties in particular, whether the Republicans and the Democrats, and the parties should not forget those communities are super important, and to put some time and energy into showing that you really care about those particular communities.
I think that's really well said, and we've seen a lot of attention with particularly racial justice issues in Colorado in the past few months, and we've seen an increase in the need of expanded participation. Are there any organizations that any of you are familiar with that are really leading on this topic that we should be paying attention to? Obviously, we're all following the ACLU, a historical partner in fighting for civil liberties and access to the voting booth, but who else would you recommend that we pay attention to that's supporting access for everyone, our Black and brown neighbors, our recent immigrants, to have access to the polls?
Well, I know that CCJRC, which is the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, they're doing a lot of work in African-American communities, primarily in Aurora and some parts of Colorado Springs. CIRC, which is the Immigrant Rights Coalition, they have an action fund that is trying to do a little bit more about lifting the importance of elections. And then Mi Familia Vota is, of course, another one that is doing a lot in that community. So there's quite a few really good grassroots organizations that are very, very sophisticated and really know how to do voter outreach and turnout in those communities.
And to jump in, I think Denise is 100% correct. And we try to, lean into making sure that voting is very accessible. Gosh, I think it was last week. All the days, are you guys experiencing during COVID all the days?
What day is it today?
It's Groundhog Day.
I think it's Wednesday. I think it might have been Wednesday yesterday. I'm not sure.
Who knows? But it wasn't like the last 2 weeks, I think. We went down to visit with the Ute Mountain Ute, one of the two tribes in Colorado, and then visited the next week virtually with the Southern Ute. And tribal voting in Colorado was not recognized as a guaranteed right until the 70s. So when you go down and you say, well, why is voter registration so low? Why is turnout so low? It's not because grandparents were disenfranchised, it's because the parents were disenfranchised. And so you have to work all that harder to bridge the gap, to build trust. The tribes have said that I'm the first Secretary of State to ever go meet with them. So last year, it's really meaningful, especially with everything going on. But last year, we passed a big voting rights package for Native people living on tribal lands, working with both tribes. And then we just went down again and said, what do you need? And we were planning and then stopped because of COVID, but the tribes wanted to move forward, at least the Ute Mountain Ute, is my office working with them to hire an employee, our employee, to do voter outreach. Recognizing that someone from one of the tribes is the most appropriate person to do that work. And I think that's a great idea. And we just, we're posting the job. It's going to be a temporary position, but hopefully we can do that long term. And with other communities, our office has gone through a renaissance of sort. I'm the first Democrat in 60 years. And so, or the first elected. So I have different ways of looking at things, and we've been building out public engagement, a position specifically for that. We do all of our outreach in English and Spanish. So I most of the time I'm able to communicate fairly well in Spanish. Once in a while I forget a word or two, but we'll be doing PSAs, voter registration, all in Spanish. And then also, I thought it was really important to work with members of the African-American community, especially on the heels of all the protests, to do March to the Polls through historically African-American communities, to channel and connect the idea that the power of protest is very powerful, but the power of voting is also very powerful. So that's something I think we'll do again. And one of the reasons, Emma announced it, it's not announced yet, but we will be announcing Sunday voting.
It is my county. Like I had the inside scoop.
Inside scoop from Emma Pinter, the wonderful commissioner. But you know, we have early voting, but it excludes Sundays. I grew up working class. I know people sometimes they get the weekend off and they cannot vote during the week. And so it's been, I wanted in our legislation last year to include Sundays. It didn't get into the bill, it got cut out. But when we're in COVID, we need to give as many early votings as possible. So I'm going to announce an initiative, and Adams is the first county. We're going to announce it with Adams, that I'll fund all Sunday voting the Sunday before Election Day. And the idea, if we could pull it together, is to do March to the Polls on Sunday. So I think it's always a topic that we have to continually work on. But you know, you put the time, you put the effort in, communities appreciate you showing up. And I do think Denise is very right. You hear from community members what they think is the most important, and to the extent you can, try to meet them and provide it.
Yeah, that'll be great. I'll march with you to the polls any day. Like, that sounds great. We'll help everyone get to the polls.
Awesome.
I love it. You set the time, I'll show up. I do have a question that I get all the time, and I feel like it's been in the media, and I'd really love all of your opinions on this. I think we're used to election results coming out almost immediately. The polls close, and 7:30, we're getting updates, and polls close in this state, we're getting updates 20-30 minutes later. This particular election is very intense. It's going to be intense. Can we expect results that night, or can we expect results the morning after, November 4th? What are you all suggesting, advising, considering for when we can expect election results this year?
I am muted first, so I'll answer first, and then I would love to hear Robert and Denise. I think that the preface of this question is a bigger question, or a bigger point. And that point is that we have a president of the United States, which is supposed to be the bedrock of freedom and democracy, setting up a series of traps, any of which he can then use to say the election was not fair. He literally just said in the last 5 minutes that he is not going to concede the election because it will be a continuation of his tenure. How does he know that without looking into a magic ball? We've seen a pattern of voter suppression and things that you usually do not hear in a democracy coming out of the president. That includes lies about vote by mail, lies about the type of foreign interference, litigation on ballot drop boxes, the attack of the Postal Service, which a federal judge just found was politically motivated, and a threat to send armed enforcement to the polls, which is a tactic straight out of the Jim Crow South. So there's a series of things he is setting up. One of them is the false narrative that if the ballots aren't counted on election night, they're no good. There's 3 things that we all as community leaders need to be saying. Number 1, election night results are never official. Military and overseas voters have 8 days to get their ballots in. We do audits, we do signature cures, and that's just not how it works. Number 2, we are in the middle of a pandemic. Vote by mail is the responsible way to vote. And although I was pushing for all states to adopt our model to start processing ballots 15 days before Election Day, which enables us to get a lot of the results, if not all of them, but a lot of them up on election night, that unfortunately just is not going to be the case. Michigan, the Secretary of State wanted to start processing, the legislature won't let her. That doesn't mean the results are no good. What it means is that they're choosing security and accessibility over quick results. And quick results are not the most important thing when it comes to the election. So I do think we have to push back on the falsehoods. We have to understand that delayed results are not inherently bad. They're only bad because the president is putting up a false dichotomy that if it's not done, it's no good. And we have to be very clear with media, national media, local media, that you all know in Colorado, there's a lot of times when elections are not called on election night, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that.
I don't really have a lot to add, Secretary of State Griswold, you really did hit on all of it. And I do believe that all of what's happening is, in DC and at the White House is just a bunch of, smoke and mirrors and a way for people to question if the election results will be valid once they're certified and confirmed to be what they are. And that's really all this is about. The ACLU is concerned about what will happen after Election Day. Will there be protests from one side or the other? I'm almost certain that there will be. And what does that look like? Because there will be a lot of indictments of the results and the integrity of the election. And it's all, never thought I would see this day that it is coming from the President of the United States, which is just absolutely insane. I don't even know what to do with that. One of the things that I found fascinating, we have always thought in the ACLU that of course there is, I think it's the Washington Post that tracks how many lies come out of the White House. And so, but there's no real way to make a lawsuit about that or to do anything about it. And the president continues to throw out all of this misinformation, just has already been cited. But I never thought we would see the day when the U.S. Postal Service would send out a mailer that was just absolutely false. And that is something that you could do a lawsuit on. And the Secretary of State's office beat us to it. Thank you very much. But it's the same that's the kind of stuff you have to sort of be ready for at, what's going to come out next? What's going to be the next thing? And I have no doubt that of course, Colorado will be fine. The election results will be what they are, and that's that. And they will be that way across the country. What we need to be careful of in the meantime are the suppression tactics. How many folks are not going to be allowed to cast their vote as they should be, and how many votes cast won't be counted. And those are the sorts of things that definitely the ACLU will be watching very closely, and most particularly watching in the states where we're already seeing some of those tactics in use. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, it's very well said. And I too am glad that we have a Secretary of State that really proactively protects information around voting. I know you have to run. We have one last question that came in, and anyone who wants to send in a question through the question and answers, we have several more for Denise and Robert, but this one I think particularly applies to clerks and the Secretary of State's office. What procedures are we taking to address uncounted ballot debacles, such as it was experienced in Mesa County, to ensure this doesn't happen again anywhere in Colorado?
So we have protocols on the books. Denise can attest to that. A lot of the civil organizations can attest to that, about how our election should run. And when there is problems with the election, it's my job to oversee the process. The Secretary of State doesn't count or administer the election. We oversee the process. I try to protect people's right to vote. That's my job. So when there are problems, and to tell you, there's always election issues. A lot of times they're small, they don't rise to in big proportions, but we send support staff across the state all the time. So we've sent folks in the last elections to Adams, to Arapahoe, to all these counties. And it's not because they're massively having problems, it's that we want to add a little bit of support. When there are bigger problems, I have the power to do election orders or even take over an election as a last result. We also have litigation tools, which sometimes we have to use. We try to be as collaborative as possible. I want to have a great relationship with the clerks, but ultimately it's my job to make sure that Coloradans voters have access and their voice heard and their ballots counted. And just as you see with all of our action with the Postmaster General, we're now 2 successful lawsuits in, and we're making sure that words match up with actions, and when they don't, I'll make sure to do everything I can to make sure that they do. One of the things in the upcoming election that we've been really focused on is just training. There's a lot of new rules because of COVID, so we've been working really collaboratively. We're also hiring new support staff. My office just does not have enough personnel to cover the entire state. So we're hiring 2 more people to focus on county outreach to make sure the counties have what they need. And also we'll hire contractors so that we have folks in different parts of the state to get there rapidly if an election problem exists. But my main message to all Coloradans is just make sure you're registered to vote. So easy in Colorado. Can you imagine 2020, some states don't have online voter registration? I can't even believe it. Something we need to change in 2021, make that mandatory for all states. But lucky Colorado, you could register right online, govotecolorado.gov. And then I would say, make a plan to vote and make sure people around you have a plan to vote. This year, vote your ballot early, get it in early. We want to be able to post as many election results on election night. The clerks will thank you. All the ballots, so many of them come in Monday and Tuesday. It's just such a huge task. There's millions of voters. So make a plan to vote, hopefully put in your plan, vote early, return your mail ballot to a drop box or put it in the mail all the way until October 26th. After that, go vote in person. You can use a drop box. We have some of the most accessible elections in the nation. And the last thing I will say, I did a election security event with Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota this morning. I'll tell you, I like Senator Klobuchar. Every time I see her, she reminds me Minnesota has been beating us in voter turnout.
Yes.
You guys, Colorado is forcing me to have this walk of shame every time I see her. So I'm hoping that we will beat Minnesota, have a great election, have a lot of people get their ballots in, and just move into the future with great elections and a democracy that we all can believe in.
Well, that gives me hope, and that makes, we have a plan, we're going to do it, and we got a Secretary of State who's going to protect our right to vote and the election security. So thank you. I know you have to step off early. We're going to continue with Denise and Robert. We have a few more questions lined up for them. There's a lot to discuss: poll watchers and legal observers and election protections and the historical nature of the 2020 elections. But thank you, Secretary, for your time. Have a good evening and be well.
Thank you, Emma. My dear friend Emma, she's so smart. She does such good work. Love her partnership. Denise, thank you guys. ACLU is protecting our Constitution. And Robert, so nice to meet you. Hopefully meet you soon, one day in person. So see y'all later.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, well, that certainly left us a lot to talk about. The first thing I briefly mentioned was poll watchers and legal observers. This is something that the ACLU is definitely known for. And Robert, I know that students and college students definitely do a lot of poll watching. I would love to hear from both of you what you're seeing for poll watching, legal observing this year, this 2020, to protect our elections, do voter protection work.
Sure. Well, let me start off by it looks like there's actually a whole lot of interest, right? Outside of a few Republicans needed in Denver, most counties have more than their share, fair share. So, I think that it's the excitement of the election, great promotion by the Secretary of State, but also just heightened awareness on both sides of the aisle for the importance of this election. And I imagine it depends on which side of that aisle you sit, are your concerns about where that poll watching should go. But it's good to see lots of folks there. And at Metro State, for instance, we have done a really good job of helping to recruit folks for Denver in particular, but also the surrounding counties, trying to get our students involved. So you're going to see a younger set, not just the Scrabble set, I guess, which has been the traditional poll watchers in Colorado.
Yeah, it's so funny, but while I was sitting here, I got this text message about, do you want to poll watch on election day? And so there's definitely somebody's doing some push out there, which is great. I'll tell you that Common Cause coordinates a voter protection unit. The ACLU participates, and so every election we have folks either from Common Cause on a nonpartisan basis all over the state, wherever they're needed, because that's typically, there are partisan folks, but then there's also someone that should be around that's nonpartisan. And so Common Cause does a really good job of recruiting those folks. So I would encourage people to, if they're still interested and want to do it on a nonpartisan basis, they can get on the Common Cause Colorado website and figure that out. That's something that I do every election. And much like what Robert said, there's a great deal of interest in it. And I think that means that people are paying attention. They're paying attention to the fact that that there could be some irregularities, and we need folks there to make sure that everyone who wants to vote votes, and everybody who votes, their vote is counted.
And if I could follow up real quick, I mean, one of the things from that last general question that maybe was left unsaid is that I think, you know, there's a balance between being very concerned about voter suppression and being very concerned about misinformation and leading voters to think that there will be some mischief, either from the right or the left. That certainly is possible, and we expect those things to happen. But at the same time, I really want to underscore, and this is what the Secretary said as well, Colorado in particular, but the United States generally, is one of the most clean and secure election systems in the world, and voters shouldn't be turned away or have any sense that they shouldn't participate because their votes won't be counted. And so, you know, as we think about that, I think the risk for, you know, concern post-election comes from both sides. There will be a protest, and you know, as we look back on it, though, it's important to remember that for the most part, you know, our system runs fairly fairly, not perfectly, but reasonably.
Yeah, we put a lot of work into it. You know, Robert, I know you publish books and, you know, the chair of a political science department. Colorado has a unique and robust voting system. I'm kind of curious if you get questions from colleagues in other states from a political science perspective on the uniqueness of the Colorado system, and what do you hear about the most from colleagues who live in other places where voting has to be in person or is something more cumbersome?
Sure, and you know, I actually hear it from around the world. I hosted a series of journalists from Northern Europe a few years ago, before the pandemic, and mail-in ballots was something I was pitching. We were doing really well, and our voter turnout had increased quite a bit. You know, some of the major concerns are ones that, you know, really have been dispelled by Colorado's experience. Questions of fraud, for instance, pressure from spouses, for instance, to vote one way or the other. Collection of ballots and then hiding those ballots or destroying them. Those things just haven't, you know, occurred in Colorado, and we've done a fairly good job, both under the Secretary's watch, but also prior to that, since we've established this in 2014. So, you know, it doesn't require a certain partisan orientation to carry out mail-in ballots well. We can do that regardless, and so those kind of concerns. But it also does. There have been concerns about how ballots are mailed. I had one colleague from Georgia being concerned about the potential for a Secretary of State in Georgia, for instance, to purge voter registration rules and then have a significant portion, particularly African-American population, removed from the polls. And if you're not going down to the polls and you just don't get your ballot, right, that becomes that much more difficult to rectify if it's election day or post-election day. So, you know, those are some of the concerns we see. We haven't experienced them in Colorado. Don't seem to be experienced in Oregon with a longer history, or Washington State. And so, you know, these are things that I really think are misperceptions of mail-in ballots.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. Not only are the ballots on individual proprietary paper, but they're individually numbered. I remember the first year I was on a ballot, I got so excited. I opened it up, I voted for myself, and then I closed the ballot. And I was like, oh no, I can't break my secrecy sleeve. I don't want to spoil this ballot. Kind of also want to keep it because it's the first one with my name on it. And I went down to the election office. I said, what do? I spoiled my ballot. I didn't vote for the other races who are also important on this ballot. And they said, oh yes, you know, each ballot is uniquely identified. We will void your ballot so that it no longer counts in our system. And if it accidentally is returned, it'll automatically be discarded. We will get you a new unique identifier tied to your voter ID. And I was able to vote a full and complete ballot and still have my election count, and then have that spoiled ballot from 2013, which has been cherished memento since that time. But it was a unique way to learn that not only is the paper proprietary and secure, but also each ballot is numbered and uniquely tied, so that they are uniquely identified and cannot be duplicated. There's no, that's not a thing that can happen. But in a presidential year, there is certainly a lot of attention. Denise, going back to you, before your tenure serving at the ACLU, you actually served as Director of Operations for, at the time, Vice President Biden and General Counsel under President Barack Obama, which is not something I knew about your history until prepping for chatting with you this evening.
Oh, is that right? Oh, okay.
New facts. Of course, I knew you came in qualified to work at the ACLU, but your work at the ACLU has been stunning enough that I've been impressed there. You certainly have been inside a presidential election before. What do you think we can expect from the campaigns and from the White House? What is the difference between protocol and what's required by law as you're approaching a transition or an election year from either the presidential campaign or the office of the president itself?
This particular president has broken lots of rules. So what would be protocol is, of course, they're separate. And there is a requirement that things are absolutely separate. And so there is the campaign side, and that is paid for by the party. So everything that was done for then Vice President Biden was done with Democratic Party money, not White House money, if it was campaign related. And then, of course, those things that are done on the official record are, of course, done with government taxpayer funds because they are official. It's official business. So even phone calls that the vice president would do that were campaign related were made in his personal phone and not in the White House. And so there's been lots of protocols. But like I said, when you have a president who hosts the Republican National Convention within the White House, that seems to run afoul of a lot of the protocols that we have upheld dearly for forever. And so, but I do want to assure people that the norm is you don't mesh those two things together. And I can't think of any president who has broken those protocols certainly in my lifetime.
I would agree. And it's been interesting, even from a local government perspective. There was a local mayor, Mayor Jen Coleman from Thornton, who used city funds to fly to DC to attend events surrounding the RNC at the White House. So it's interesting that behavior has trickled down to local Republicans thinking, I would never have thought it would be appropriate to use funds in that way. But
yeah, I think when the highest office in the land can sort of cut corners, it does leave people thinking it's probably acceptable or okay, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree. Looking at the history of everything that's gone on, both of you have spoken about the unique nature of this election. What are we doing to combat the misinformation? We heard quite a bit about it from the Secretary of State, but from an academic perspective or from the ACLU perspective, what are we doing to combat some of this misinformation, to get out correct information, to hopefully increase some voter confidence?
Well, I think the Secretary of State has certainly done a really good job I think all of the national media attention that she's received, she's certainly dealt with it very, very well and has provided the counter. And that really seems to be really what we all need to do, is to counter that. I really do appreciate there's a lot of folks that are doing that, not just the ACLU. There's a lot of groups and organizations that are, and county clerks, I think that our county clerks, the County Clerk Association and the county clerks themselves are really pretty amazing. They care about the integrity of the elections that they run. That's on them, and they take those things very, very seriously. So I certainly applaud their efforts as well as the Secretary of State's efforts. And then I think the only way to counter, deal with bad information is to give folks good information. And there's a lot of folks that are doing that, and we just have to keep doing it till it's over. Sorry, Robert, I didn't mean to jump in there.
Oh, no,
first.
fair enough. I'm just going to jump in. I mean, I think, and I don't mean to interrupt you. I mean, I think that's exactly right. We need to, provide good information to counter misinformation, but it's tricky in a lot of ways. And so, for instance, people find information that confirms their biases, and the most potent of misinformation is that something that has kind of a kernel of the truth, right, or something that strikes an individual as reasonable. So we can, and this isn't just this election, by the way. This has been going on for centuries, trying to get people to not turn out to vote or question whether they should vote or change their minds. So it's not unique. I think we just have different technology that makes it that much more easy to do and everywhere in a lot of ways. But I guess there's two sides to that. Then on one side, it's down the road. It's not going to happen this year. But there is the potential for policy and for severe fines or jail time for folks that intentionally engage in disinformation, which is kind of by definition intentional. But also from a personal side, and this is, I think, really important to recognize that, you and I and every one of this panelists and Secretary Griswold as well are susceptible to these psychological orientations. I mean, we easily buy into information that confirms our pre-existing biases. And so we really need to, as individuals, step back. I mean, not me, everybody else, right? Of course, it's the way it works, but we need to.
Like, all the things, right?
Right, I do, right? Now, I always ask my students, of course, right? Is it, you aren't the ones that are the ones who are having these psychological or cognitive biases, right? No, everyone else it does, just not us. But we just need to be aware that we're human beings and check ourselves, right? Double check. Your best friend sends you something, it doesn't mean it's correct. They're your best friend. They may be a brain surgeon, but they may not know anything about politics. And particularly watch those stealthy ones that seem to make sense to you. Check it out. There's other sources.
That would be, I don't have any friends that are brain surgeons. I'm sure they're lovely, but that's not.
They're good people.
They're great.
One of the things
more friends that are lawyers. I don't know if they're better or not. No.
Well, I was just thinking when you were talking about, it's so interesting, right, to even hear the president actually advising people to vote twice, and it's just, every time he says it, there's always the national media that corrects and says, but that's a crime. And so, it's like only so much you can do. It's exhausting, but it's important.
Yeah, I think the information sources are definitely going to be critical as people make decisions. We got a question, we got quite a few piled up. A lot of you are asking similar things. This one seems to stand out and be relevant to this conversation. In 2000, the media played a role in calling the election early. What can we expect from the media this time around?
Well, maybe I can jump in. The media actually learned their lesson in 2000 and have been very cautious since 2000 in terms of the national elections. There's a couple of things. First of all, it really depends on that constellation of where those tight races are going to be. And so if the Electoral College hangs in the balance of one or two states that are very close, similar to, say, 2016, then I think we're not going to be able to go to bed the night of the 23rd with reasonable projections of who will be the winner. That said, there will be some contested close states, but if one candidate or the other amasses enough without those states, then I think the media will be able to make those projections. But exit polls are tricky and they're not very good. They're biased in and of themselves. There's elements within that, and exit polls are tough. Particularly in a pandemic kind of situation where it's not quite as easy. So we're going to be relying on survey results a little bit more than exit polls. But my guess is that of the major media outlets, there won't be many calls unless it's a done deal, really a done deal.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. They learned their lesson, and I don't think we saw that in 16. So I really do think they've learned their lesson, and I would imagine because of some states, it will take longer than the norm to do vote counting. I think they'll even be a little bit more cautious, is what I suspect.
Yeah, I would hope so, because it's so important. Actually, with that and how elections are called and everything that's going on right now, we do know that Justice Ginsburg is lying in state starting today and into tomorrow. Her passing, I think, has affected a lot of folks personally. Listening briefly to the memorial comments that were started this morning, really moving from both a personal level and professionally. I'm kind of curious, hearing both of you as great observers and having a lot of experience with elections. What do you think the loss of this justice will mean for this election in 2020, and how do you see the lack of her voice on the Supreme Court impacting what we're going to see in the next few months?
Well, you know, I think the impact on the election will be significant, although I couldn't say that it is outcome determinative, only because I think both sides have politicized her vacancy, and so it's difficult to know which way it'll go. You know, I think, at least for me personally, I think this is true for a lot of people, that, you know, between Justice Ginsburg's work ethic, her gym workouts, and I think her many health bouts where she prevailed, many of us thought she would live a lot longer than she did. You know, when I first heard of her passing, I really was in disbelief. This can't be. I got to see this from a very, very reputable news source to believe it, and unfortunately and sadly, it was true. But I do think the politicizing her vacancy is going to galvanize the right, and it's going to galvanize the left, and so that's why I don't know if it'll be outcome determinative. There is no question, however, that her absence on the court, depending on who fills that vacancy, will be outcome determinative. That will bring the court considerably more to the right. It'll be a 6-3 as opposed to a 5-4 with Roberts sometimes falling on either side. It will be definitively more to the right, and it'll be more definitively to the right for a very long time, because the justices that have been put on the court of late are younger, so they'll certainly live longer, and their legacy will last for a very, very long time. And that is, we have noticed at the ACLU that the federal bench overall has become far more conservative, and so we often look for opportunities to do our cases in state courts, because there's a little bit more opportunity for championing civil rights and civil liberties. That certainly is not the case in the federal courts, and with 4 more years of appointments, then we could expect certainly even a more entrenched right-leaning federal court that is not favorable toward plaintiffs bringing claims for civil rights violations.
Denise, I mean, obviously she knows, she's exactly right in terms of the impact on the court. I think it's interesting, though, to bring up that change in venue for where success might be from one side or the other. And so that's something we may see shifting as that Supreme Court becomes solidified to the right. You know, I think in terms of the politics, you know, with all due respect, I think it's actually going to be the vacancy process and not so much the vacancy itself that's going to, you know, drive the politics that's going to be going on here. And so, you know, my expectation is that the Trump president will nominate by, as he said, by Friday or Saturday. Mitch McConnell will hold a vote, and they'll do that probably before the election. And that that process itself, of course, going exactly against what the argument Mitch McConnell made back in 2016, Not quite exactly. He left himself an out by saying there was a Republican Senate and a Democratic president. But at the same time, that's going to energize the Democrats, I think, to a greater extent. But also, I think it really signals to the public and voters how important the Senate is. That is, that if we're looking at changing policy, it's a system of checks and balances that really has stymied a lot of work throughout the country. I also think it'll have implications for the cloture rule, or which means that the Democrats have now promised potentially to consider getting rid of the filibuster. Of course, if there was a filibuster right now for Supreme Court, we would be having a very different discussion about how that works. So I think it's important to keep in mind that filibusters go one way or the other, kind of depending on whether you're in the minority or not. So yeah, it will energize the public. It probably will be a bit of a wash. It may depend on who exactly is nominated, but I think this has been such an eventful year. This is just one more layer of the politics. I have to remind people, we started this year with an impeachment, and it's almost we almost forget about that in between everything else that has happened. So lots of things to think about, lots of points entering the voters' mind, and I think those are elements. This is one more layer. It's probably the most recent, so it might be the most weighted.
One thing that I would add that you mentioned that perhaps people will recognize how important the Senate is. What I hope is that people will realize how important the judicial branch is and how much it plays a real role in some ways and to a greater extent in your everyday life than some of the electeds do. And so I think that is one thing that the individuals that and I think this is the one where it's the most prominent, is opponents to abortion have been very, very clear about what they want to do with the federal bench. And they've never took their eye off that prize. And that is one thing that I don't think proponents of abortion access or reproductive rights have done nearly as good of a job. And so there might be something about Justice Bader Ginsburg's vacancy that in particular highlights, because her history and her track record of championing women's rights and equality are just unprecedented, that there may be more of a reason to really recognize how important the role of that Supreme Court justice really does play in everybody's everyday life. Justice Bader Ginsburg, for folks that don't know, she's probably one of the ACLU's most illustrious alums. She started her legal career in the 80s at the ACLU, and in her short span, 1972, in a short span of 8 years at the ACLU, she brought forward hundreds of cases, 34 of them of which went to the Supreme Court. She argued 7 of them and she won 6 of them. This is, she left us at the ACLU in particular quite a legacy. And we all, as a people, as a community, as individuals who care about equality, she's left an amazing legacy for all of us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If you are out there and you haven't really read up on what Justice Ginsburg did for women and for community, I think that Netflix is streaming On the Basis of Sex, which is a significant portion of one of the cases that she worked on gender equality. And then also, I believe Hulu is streaming RBG, which is a great documentary, very informative. I got to see it live with some of the producers and directors in Denver back in the before times when we saw Humans in person last year. And it's a really good documentary. I highly recommend. We do have a lot.
Did you see that at the Alamo?
Yeah.
It was actually our screening. It was a CLU screening. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
it was. I have a great little buttons and like all kinds of, there are chocolates, in the before times when we saw people in person in large groups. We'll get back there. We'll see people in large groups soon. We do have a bunch of questions in the chat. One of them I think is particularly interesting. It's a little bit of a pivot, but it goes back to this question around procedures and law. I know there have been a lot of studies around this difference between protocol and rules on presidential transition. What are the steps? Do either of you have an opinion or some information on the legal process if President Trump does follow through with some of his offhand comments and chooses not to concede an election? And the process is in limbo for several weeks. Do either of you have any thoughts or opinions? We have seen this a little bit before with Bush v. Gore. I believe a number of super nerds that I was probably friends with went as hanging chads to Halloween parties during that era. It certainly left an impression on a lot of folk. This election could be very different folks in the race this year. What would happen if some of these offhand comments from President Trump turn out to be his actual intention and he doesn't concede the election? What would happen?
I'm going to let you go first, Robert.
I don't know if I have a great answer whatsoever from a legal standpoint. I mean, ultimately, if he wants to stay in his office, that the U.S. assume, right, we have marshals that remove him. But I guess to some extent, no. I mean,
No, I think that's what you're left with, right? But you're just kind of thinking, good gracious, would this really happen?
But here again, I think, and I would say that the question, seriousness of that question, and then was equal back in 2000, right? Well, I guess, it was open seat, so maybe not so much. But look, I'm not going to lose sleep over that outcome. President Trump says a lot of things, and I'm not as an apologist for President Trump, but I think he just says a lot of things, and he doesn't.
Oh, I see. So you actually think he won't do that?
No, he's not.
Why you're not losing?
No, I mean, I don't think. I think ultimately, the Republican Party, if he does have that inclination, there is enough within the Republican Party that will push him to say, let's do it, because you're going to hurt our chances for for holding this office for decades, if that's the case.
And Trump is really worried about those things.
No, but he's worried about his legacy, right? And he's worried about his image, and I don't know.
No, I mean, you're right.
It's something I lose a whole lot of sleep over, and generally I'm right on with that with that. More important things in my life right now than worrying about whether Trump will leave office if he loses the election.
Well, that's actually good. I appreciate that. And I think also it brings to mind that he does everything that he's done so far with a coalition. And there are other statesmen, stateswomen in the Senate who might have opinions on whether or not you would tarnish your party's perception moving forward, because that's a great historical perspective. Thank you for calling us back to history. We do have a few more really specific questions in the chat. I thought this one was particularly good. It's a little bit different. We often talk about voting and voting access in huge urban areas where there are lines, and we discussed poll watching. Common Cause was brought up as a great way to get involved in voter protection, but also outreach to rural communities and voting access for rural communities. And I'm just kind of curious if either of you, Colorado is a big state. I did mention, it's on my social media, y'all know, I'm driving cross country right now to fetch my sister, who is working remotely for the foreseeable future and is gonna move in with us. So I'm in a hotel room myself, and Colorado is a big, beautiful state, and it's a lot of rural, a lot of ag, and folks disconnected from the urban community. It's beautiful, but it's remote. What are we doing for voter protection for folks who live in rural areas? Do you have any thoughts or comments on rural communities in Colorado and voting?
I don't know that we, the ACLU, are, I mean, we're doing webinars, and one of the reasons why we're doing webinars, oddly enough, is because of the virus, but what we realize is that's what we should do more often, because then we have greater reach than beyond the metro area. And so that's really the extent of our bandwidth. I do know that certainly what I think you mentioned earlier, Robert, about the recruiting of election judges and all that is statewide, and I think they've had some pretty good responses statewide, as I understand, but that's about all I know.
You know, and outside of what Secretary Griswold mentioned in terms of outreach to Native American communities, the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that most rural counties actually have fairly high voter turnout relative to urban counties. So Denver, for instance, has lower voter turnout than a vast majority of rural counties. So it's also something that's not always on the radar in terms of concerns for voter outreach. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but for the most part, I think it's left to the parties. And for the most part, that's Republicans that have been in the Trump campaigns that have been reaching out to make sure that those campaigns are out there. And in Colorado, I think primarily, the Gardner campaign that's really kind of pushing that rural vote. So, the parties and those organizations are the ones that have been doing it.
Yeah, I will have to say, driving through Colorado, there are a lot of very large Cory Gardner signs, like all the way through our state. So definitely a lot of participation if field signs and yard signs are a measure for voter enthusiasm. I have one more question, and then we'll get to concluding remarks. Thank you so much for being here. I thought this was a really interesting question. Will online voting registration and online access harm voters' privacy? Voters' access is important, but the balance to that is making sure that people's voter file is protected. Do you have any thoughts on right to privacy in an information age when it comes to voting?
Right. Well, I guess I'll start. I don't see Denise.
I think she's a dog.
Fair enough.
I heard a furry friend commenting.
I'll talk by default. It's fine.
I was wondering that if you heard that or not. This is just a funny story, but it's like when my neighbor goes out, my little dog goes little bonkers, and that's what was happening. So now the neighbor came to get her. So we're all good.
2020. What can you do? We're working from home.
Right. It wouldn't be a Zoom call if there weren't a dog.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the question was voters' right to privacy, online access. What's the balance there? Robert, if you want to get us started.
Well, I guess ironically, one of the examples of voter misinformation that has been cited in some of the academic work are some points in, and I can't remember which state right now, but essentially letting voters, saying to voters, don't send in your ballot because it has all this specific information in it, and the governments will use that for whatever nefarious purposes that they have, whether it's picking up folks with criminal backgrounds or other privacy issues. The bottom line is that we have a technological society that we make a lot of improvements by doing that. We can count votes easier. We can track votes easier, track ballots, not necessarily votes. I think that's really important to keep in mind. But again, it's public information, and where you live and whether you voted or not, that's been around for a long time. I've been able to get that. Parties have been able to get that information for decades. Nothing new there, just a slightly different way of delivering your ballot. So something I wouldn't worry about again, but also something that becomes bigger than it really is in terms of an issue. Privacy is privacy, but we're talking about name, address, and whether you turn in your ballot or not for the most part. And again, that's been public information for a very, very long time, not just in this environment.
It's
Go ahead, Denise. Yeah.
I'm just going to say real quick, I think the ACLU, there's not enough tinfoil in the world for our tinfoil hats. We're very, very, very crazy privacy freaks. And every time there is a conversation, which I think this is interesting, every time there's a conversation of a big data privacy bill, a bill that will really, really protect one's privacy, it's what's always exempted are political parties, so they can still get access to the voter database, and nonprofits, so they can still get access to a donor database, and so it's interesting. And I think there's a little bit of mixed views even within the ACLU. Believe it or not, we're not a monolith, but there's definitely some folks that would say, you know, the voter database provides too much information and does invade privacy, in the sense that there were the good old days when you wanted to have your telephone number unpublished when it was in the white pages, you know. Well, you can't do that now because it's in the voter database. And so, you know, there's a lot of things that I think people do have some stressors about in the privacy side. So it's a balance, but I would tend to agree that at least the way things are running now, there isn't a real big worry of huge breaches of privacy. And I guess that's what matters. Although, I mean, sometimes I get a little freaked out when I'm like, oh, they know exactly when I mailed my ballot because they tell me. Or not mailed it, but, oh, we got it. Or, you know, your ballot has been counted. I'm like, man, that's a lot of stuff they know. So it's a balance.
You know, remember that, you know, back in the day before when we went into groups and stood in line and then checked our ballots, that the party had information. They would call every couple of hours with that precinct to get the list. And then if you didn't vote and you were part of their party, you know, if you're affiliated with that party,
they would
get the phone call to remind you to go vote. And it was seen as good democracy, right? A way to mobilize voters and get people out. And it was standard when, you know, we look back when there were actually, you know, we had relatively high voter turnout in this country. So, you know, those are the trade-offs that, you know, it takes information to mobilize. That may be one of the trade-offs.
Yeah, it is definitely an interesting balance. I would highly recommend anyone who is curious to volunteer either with the ACLU Common Cause, which was highlighted, Mi Familia Vota, what is it, CIRC. We also talked about CIRC being really active, and there are all kinds of voter encouragement organizations out there. I also really love volunteering and being active with my local county. It might be a little late this year to volunteer to be an election judge or to be on the canvas board, but it is a truly unique experience to see an election take place and certify that election. So if this is something that you're passionate about and voter protection is something you're passionate about, check in with your local clerk. It's a fascinating process. One of the things that gives me the most confidence, I know the secretary spoke about this early in our talk, but the machines that count our ballot, that do the tabulation, are not connected to the internet. In an era where we think of everything being connected, the ballots are physically separated, the computers are physically separated and not online, so that they can do that tabulation, and then to watch that moment where they walk the flash drive over to upload the results is kind of a beautiful election night phenomenon. So I would encourage everyone to get out and do that if you can, and if you're interested and you're nerdy like myself. We've talked about a lot of things that are concerning. We've talked a lot of things that are worrying us, but I would like to close with what is giving you hope for the 2020 election. Is there something that you have seen in the past few weeks and months, or that you're holding on, that's giving you hope for 2020, or you'd like to inspire others to take that next step and be more civically engaged?
Well, I think the part that's giving me hope is just what you said there at the end. It does seem that people are paying a lot more attention. And it seems like there's a lot more people that are going to vote. Perhaps I'll be curious to see what the numbers are, if it breaks some sort of records. And hopefully for Secretary of State Griswold's sake, we can beat Minnesota. But I do sense, and you know, in some ways I'm in a bubble in the sense that everybody that I work with or do things with is already civically engaged and interested. But I do sense that people are very much more in tune than they have been in years past. So I'm hopeful that we're gonna have a good voter turnout, and yeah, I'll leave it at that. Democracy will work.
Yeah. Well, and I am too, and I think, you know, to echo and maybe build on Denise's point, you know, we saw record voter turnout in the primary, high voter turnout in 2018. That, you know, I think that's going to build, and I imagine that, you know, the element, all at least in Colorado, everything the political scientists know how to do, or that we know works, we've done in terms of changing the rules and public policy. So at some point it's up to organizations to mobilize and up to citizens to vote. But our citizens have seemed to step up to that. And so I have this great hope that we will have high turnout. Interest in elections tends to spur more people to realize that these elections are meaningful, but it doesn't, there is a difference between the parties, and I think that's important, whichever side of the aisle you tend to fall on. I am a little concerned about the following weeks after the election, but I think that'll die down if the election is confirmed. And a lot of people will vote, and depending on the direction of that outcome, we'll survive another 4 years. Maybe some folks too happier than others with that result, but it's the way it works. It's democracy.
I love it. I love that we're both ending. You're both ending on democracy will work. Vote your full ballot. Register early. Thank you both for your time this evening. We sent thanks to Secretary Griswold when she signed off. We're really lucky to have both of you educating our young people and increasing voter protection. So thank you to you both, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Emma. Take care. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you both. Take care.